Hello, I'm Ella, the time-traveling pescatarian, and I've just come back from Victorian London, which is around 1837 to 1901 during the reign of Queen Victoria. During this time, 3/4 of the food on sale had been tampered with, especially the bread, which could be contaminated by things like ash, chalk, and even lead. So luckily, I'm making food from scratch today, including ginger beer. What you will need is a large bowl, which you will add the rind of half a lemon, a teaspoon of bruised ginger, half a teaspoon of cream of tartar, 70 grams of sugar, and the juice of half a lemon. Finally, you will add a liter of boiling water, which you will stir until the cream of tartar and the sugar has completely dissolved. Then you will set aside to cool until it becomes just warm to the touch before adding in half a teaspoon of brewer's yeast. This is to make sure you don't kill off the yeast. Stir again till it is completely dissolved. Then cover it and put it to the side. You're going to want to let it sit for about 20 minutes, just so that the yeast has time to activate. It will start smelling a bit of beer. Once the yeast is activated, you're going to pour that beer into a liter-sized glass bottle. This recipe is from the 1861 volume of Miss Beaton's Book of Household Management, one of the most famous Victorian cookbooks of the time. Next, we're going to be making is curry powder, which is from the 1851 Modern Domestic Cookery, written by a lady based off of the works of Miss Rundle. What you will need is a mortar and pestle. Warning, mine is a little small for what we're doing, so you might want a bigger one. You'll use 1 ounce of coriander seeds, 1 ounce of ginger, half an ounce of cayenne pepper, I tried to beat it because my mortar and pestle is a bit small, but 2 ounces of turmeric. If yours is too small like mine, do it in batches. You're going to want to grind it up until it is a fine powder. Once it is a fine powder, you're going to want to get a medium-sized pot or pan and cook off the curry powder just for a couple minutes until the powder becomes fragrant. You don't want any coloring or browning to happen on the curry powder, just want it to start to smell more fragrant and more like curry. Once it has heated through, you're going to put it into a clean container. I kept mine in the fridge to keep it fresh for longer. And for the main course, we're making prawn curry from the same cookbook written by a lady. What you'll need is a medium-sized pot filled with 2 ounces of melted butter. To that melted butter, you'll add 1 onion, You're going to cook off that onion until it is soft and translucent and only starting to get color. Then you're going to add the 2 tablespoons of the curry powder made in the last recipe. And then once that is warmed through, you're going to add flour and water depending on if you want a thicker or wetter curry. And 1 pint of cooked prawns. The prawns are already cooked, so you just want to warm everything through. Once it is warm, you're going to add 100 grams of spinach. Once the spinach has completely wilted, your curry is done. You'll serve it with a side of rice or bread. Let's see what our special guest thinks of it. So today I'm here with Hallie Conrad, who is a MA public historian and creator and co-host on
The Quack and the Cure.
Oh, amazing Victorian podcast.
Yes, very nasty.
And we're here to talk about Victorian food.
Yay.
So let's start with the ginger beer. Do you want to give it a taste?
I do. I'm excited. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. That's really good.
Yeah, it's really light.
Yeah, I was about to say, the ginger isn't too heavy.
No, it doesn't taste like a modern ginger beer.
No, definitely not.
No.
I like that better than modern ginger beer.
No, but it tastes more beery. Ginger, lemon, and even alcohol were huge medicinal things.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have any evidence for this recipe being used for medicinal purposes, as I think it was just supposed to be a refreshing drink you can have all year long, because the recipe would have you make I believe it was 12 dozen.
Mm-hmm.
No, 12 dozen. 4 dozen. 4 dozen.
12 dozen.
So much. No,
feed the city.
We had 4 dozen bottles of ginger beer.
Their alcohol of choice for medicine was actually brandy, because
Really?
they needed the hard liquor before they started using anesthetics. So brandy was a popular one. Can I keep drinking?
Yeah, of course. No, it's really nice. I'm honestly, I tasted it early in making it.
Mm-hmm.
So but as it's progressed, it's gotten more summery.
Yeah, definitely. It's that fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
It's very refreshing, especially with today's weather being so hot.
All right, are you ready to try some Victorian curry? Did you give it a shot?
Yes. Okay, let's see.
What are your thoughts?
Even though I don't eat curry a lot, I can tell that there's a difference.
Mhm.
In that base flavor.
Yeah. Very much the curries themselves were simple, because it was you had your curry powder recipes in these 2 sections, and you made that and then stored it for a good just in your pantry.
Mm-hmm.
And then you made your curries, but the curries themselves were really basic, but I guess you choose what curry powder you wanted to go with it.
Definitely.
So it was sort of they were getting all of these Indian spices since they had colonized India, and were trying to make food. They wanted to taste the taste of India.
They wanted flavor, which
For
was
the first time.
For the first time, they experienced flavor.
And they wanted it. And it was also people were coming back with these stories. There was these ideas, and even Queen Victoria was a huge component of curry. She always had curry stewing in her kitchen, and she was learning. She had an Indian tutor that she may or may not have had an affair with. Never confirmed.
But what about Albert?
It was after Albert died.
Okay, thank God. I just took that very personally. I love them
They are
together.
But having curry makes me just think of the Empire. Like, gin and tonic was really popular as a medicinal in the Victorian period for malaria.
Mm-hmm. And you know, the reason why part of the reason why they opened so many taverns was because people were so... That's what, like, all of the victims of Jack the Ripper were in London's East End. Like, a lot of them were described as, like, being alcoholics, but, like, gin was their drink of choice.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was really cheap back then. Not so much anymore.
Well, because it was originally made cheap by the government to deal with scurvy. That's why, like, gin and tonics became super popular for the soldiers going to India, was because the gin dealt with the scurvy and the tonic dealt with the malaria, so it was like a double cure.
That was the real cure-all.
One that actually worked, the quinine.
Yeah, exactly. During the cholera epidemic of 1854 that came from the Broad Street Pump in Soho, there was a brewery on the same street as the Broad Street Pump, and they lost nobody. They didn't lose anybody to cholera, even though they had, I think, over 70 employees. And part of that not only was because they had their own water supply, was that apparently the employees preferred to drink beer anyway. So they were avoiding the cholera water by just drinking beer.
The reason why, like, back in the day people watered down their alcohol wasn't just because they wanted, like, weaker alcohol. It was the way of making water safe, because the alcohol would kill off a lot of bacteria.
The fermentation.
So just adding water to alcohol, first of all, makes it less alcoholic, but also then, like, kills the water that you've added of any bacteria.
That makes sense. Drink beer, is what I'm hearing. It's for health reasons.
It's also because, like, food in Britain didn't need to be spicy. We talked earlier, like, before about, like, the fermentation for the ginger beer. Like, they needed to make sure that it would last because they didn't have fridges. Like, I think in the UK, electric kettles became popular in a British home before a fridge did.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, no, it really tracks.
I believe it.
But like, the winters were cold, and during the Victorian period, like, really cold. The Thames would freeze to the point you could put an elephant on top of the Thames during the Christmas markets. So, like, they didn't need spice, because part of the point of spice is to preserve foods and keep it from spoilage in hot climates. And the UK just doesn't get as hot.
It's hot right now, but that's global warming. That is climate change. This is the peak of summer right now.
Yeah.
This is like our 5th hot day this summer, and this might be the last one.
True. But it does just sort of make me wonder about, like, because with the Empire, they're suddenly in places that are very warm, having to figure out food, and then, like, enjoying it and bringing it back to the UK, and everyone being like, what is this?
Yeah, diseases too.
Yeah.
Like malaria, like you said. Cholera didn't hit England until 1831 because soldiers abroad had been getting sick and dying of it. But 1831 was the first time an Englishman died on English soil from cholera.
Yeah.
Rip. Actually, they did.
Yeah.
I think it was the World Exhibition in the 50s, I believe. That was the first time that, like, a public toilet is something like tens of thousands of people used the running toilet at the World Exhibition at the Crystal Palace because it was, like, this new thing. And by the end of the Victorian period, most houses had indoor plumbing, which led to cleanliness, which
that was
the whole thing.
Well, because wasn't there an issue with the original, like, indoor plumbing that existed, like, when it first started? Because there was, I don't remember his name. I'll put the name in at the bottom when I find it. But he had to redo the entire sewer systems because of the cholera epidemic.
Chadwick. Edwin Chadwick.
You're so smart.
Listen to my episode on cholera. Yeah, so he created this, like, committee of, like, public health. But he actually he made it so much worse because this was like when miasma theory was that everyone thought that infection and diseases were coming from the fermenting and decomposing like nastiness of London. And so Chadwick was basically like, let's get the sewage out of the cesspools under everybody's home and out of these like poverty-stricken areas, and let's just reroute it to the Thames. By doing that, the Thames then becomes this horrific sewer mess. And they knew it was a problem. They knew that that was people's primary drinking source. Mm-hmm. But they thought that they were removing the miasmas from their homes. Mm-hmm. And they didn't realize that they were putting all of these diseases into the water that people were directly drinking. And then diseases like cholera, then it's this vicious cycle because the waste from cholera victims would go back into the water, and that's how it spread so quickly. Mm-hmm. Was these like at the Broad Street pump, it started this poor little baby was sick, and her mom was like rinsing out her soiled diapers in water and then dumping it in the cesspool that led to the Broad Street pump. And that's how hundreds of people died just in that one little like 200-yard radius. Mm-hmm. It was from this little baby Lewis. Oh, poor girl, she died.
There was this rise of a middle class.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, because I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was like the lowest, like the most poverty-stricken areas. That's the people who were eating like just a fish pie that you could buy on the street. They weren't cooking, there's 10 people to a room, whole families in a room. They didn't have like kitchens and, ways to preserve and like make their own food that would last a long time. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and well, there's also like, I think that's why we see this like burst of Victorian cookbooks compared to any other period in time. Like the famous one being Miss Beaton's Household Management Guide, which was written by a woman who had no servants and did not run a household. But sounds like a lovely lady. But there was such a burst because the middle class suddenly had servants. Well, had a servant of all work, who was like this one poor woman, usually, who did the work of an entire staff for the household. And there was like this need of them knowing, like this middle class needing to know how to manage a household, what to tell them, and also like this ginger beer is from a later Miss Beaton's book, and they needed to like give these like women of all work like this is a guide to do this.
Do it yourself, basically, right? Yeah.
Because like before it'd be like you'd work under, like you would just learn to cook by being like a scullery maid under a certain cook, and then like it would move along. Mm-hmm. So, but then there needed to be like this spurge of like, you have to do all of these jobs. You will not be trained to do all of these jobs, but here is a book to try to help you do all of these jobs.
Yeah. It's interesting too, like this is just reminding me that there was so much less immigration back then too. Like there were, like London is so multicultural now, and it's so common to have I'm just thinking in our flat alone, we've got people from all over the world who make very different meals. And they're trying to make these international meals, but it's still like this massive urban population is still mostly English people from all over the country. Just happen to have a lot of them in London.
Even like thinking about like this curry versus a modern curry is like my clear thing like is there's no tomatoes in it, which makes sense because tomatoes were from the States. And it was really hard to bring them over to the UK, and they weren't popular for a long time because they were nightshade, and people were a little like about it, especially since it was a bit of an uphill climb for the tomato in the UK, because in the 18th century a lot of rich people ate on lead plates.
Yep.
Love a bit of lead. And
yeah, they did.
The issue with tomatoes is lead messes with them and it seeps into it, so they would start eating lead by digesting tomatoes that like sat on a lead plate for a certain amount of time.
They didn't need that extra lead. They were getting enough lead and arsenic and their wallpaper and curtains and makeup
And dresses.
And everything, anything with a dye, basically. Like, so many like dyed things had arsenic. And it's funny because they didn't realize the issue until like scientists were dying like 20 years after like discovering, doing like discoveries with radiation and stuff, and they were like, oh my god, like it took so long for them to realize, because crazy. They also a lot of like education, like a lot of developments in like public education happened during this period too. First with the ragged schools, which weren't great, but at least then they were trying to educate these like poverty-stricken kids who were mostly working in factories. That was, I think, in like the 1840s maybe, that ragged schools became a thing. But then of course we've got further industrialization, and
well, it's like speaking towards education with what I was saying about the rise of cookbooks, is the famous thing is like the rise of penny dreadfuls. Reading became not just an upper class endeavor.
Yeah, more people were literate.
Because like there was more like there was this ragged school.
The ragged schools.
Yes. There's the ragged schools, but there was also more like church schools. There were, and just like the idea of like women should also be educated, not just really rich women to a certain point, but like all women, and moving towards that sort of like education for all. There was the rise in like national trust, English heritage, like a lot more idea of like giving, like these things shouldn't just be for the wealthy. Maybe it's good to give them to the poor general public.
Yeah, and think like Royal Holloway University was originally opened by the Queen in the 1880s to educate middle class women, and I don't remember when it became co-ed, but it was originally intended just for women.
But it's also, because like cookbooks, there's a lot of sort of like, or with using cookbooks of certain eras, because the only cookbooks that exist were for monarchs. Like they were like, this was like the chef that like cooked for like these monarchs and has decided to write a book. To sort of show off how great and smart he is. While like with the Victorian period, with the rise of literacy, in this like idea of like, no, like everyone should have access to it. You had access of more cookbooks, and not just cookbooks, like gardening books, just a multitude of how-tos.
Books.
Just books. There's current theories within like the food history world that the reason why there's more cookbooks now, and like why the old cookbooks just did not have measurements, is because our our cooking literacy's gone down.
Absolutely. I mean, they used to just cook by taste.
Yeah.
That's such a good point about measurements. Like that's what my mom says when I'm like, "What's your spaghetti recipe?" She's like, "I don't know. I just throw whatever together." Like, and I feel like that's an issue. I find this with recipes that say add salt to taste. And I'm like, but how much? Like, I don't know how much, and I don't want to, I don't want to overdo it, but I don't want to, add a little bit, keep going, like having to taste it every 10 seconds.
Yeah, but like you only start seeing recipes that have like practical measurements in the end of the Victorian period. Not like, it's like, I want to say like 1870 to 1880, because all these recipes had like exact measurements. But like anything past before this did not, and there was an idea that like just cooking literacy has gotten worse, and also like the purpose of a cookbook has changed, because like as you said, like your grandma just had the cards, and I know my family, like there's some steps that are just missing from the card, because they're like, you should know to do this.
Absolutely.
So like recipes just did not fit those purposes, and also they were like, it was supposed to be for a person. Like, you weren't cooking for a restaurant. You were supposed to be cooking either for yourself and your family, or for like a master that's employing you as a servant. And so like you didn't want it to be like a strict, like, this is how it is, this is what you want to make, and like go with that. You wanted it to be like, here's a rough recipe. You can change it.
Yeah.
Like, this is just an idea.
Go.
If the person you're cooking for doesn't like this, you can change it to this, or like do something else. Like, when this goes well, but you can add other things too. Like, this recipe, I think, like, is supposed to be very basic, but you can very easily add things to it without it changing too much.
You know what this has made me think about too, is I feel like a lot of these traditional recipes from other countries, they didn't measure. Like, it was passed down through families. So how does that translate to, you're now bringing it to a brand new country. These are new spices, new flavors, new recipes. I wonder how long it took them. Like, maybe that's why it took, you know, maybe 20, 30 years for them to get measurements, because they had to figure out what the measurements were. Because it's not like they could go to the original recipe and it says, okay, 1 teaspoon of cayenne pepper or whatever. Yeah, a lot of cayenne pepper, but cayenne powder. But yeah, that's.
And it's also just the like. I also think, like, you start seeing the change of like who these recipes are for. Like, they're now for everyone. Well, before they were not for everyone.
Yeah. It's for the people.
For the people. Any last thoughts?
I mean, this has just been so interesting. My brain has been focused on Victorian medicine specifically for 6 months. So it's interesting to like talk about food rather than drugs and poisons and germs and festering gangrene and stuff. But yeah, I just think this like speaks to, you don't really think it, like, these are such common recipes in here, like in England, and I feel like most people wouldn't even like make the connection of like, this is a result of empire, this is a result of like this globalization for England and every other country too, because then, you know, we've got tomatoes are now coming from the US and potatoes too, right?
Yeah.
And corn. And corn, yes.
A lot of
think about that. England loves corn. They love corn, and they don't give credit to the Native Americans for that. The first Thanksgiving. God, I'm so tired of the corn here. I want American corn. I want like Mexican street corn.
I get that.
Yeah.
Alright. Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming on, Hallie.
Thank you for having me.
One last time, for the people in the back, where can they find you?
You can find my podcast on Spotify or my website. It's called The Quack and the Cure. I have 4 episodes about substance abuse, anesthetics. What is the other one? Antiseptics and cholera. So if anything we've talked about in this episode intrigues you on those subjects, check me out. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for feeding me.
And that's it.